Hey everyone, welcome to episode 13 of Signal or Noise. Charlie Bilello here, with me as always, Peter Mallouk. Peter, we're going to tackle a lot today. I'm going to say this is the most adventurous show yet. We have inflation on the docket, we have healthcare, we're going to try to solve Social Security, and we're going to end by talking about war. Anything else you want to add to that?
I think we've done all we can to address every major topic and step into every hot issue we possibly can in a very short period of time. So I think this is good today. I don't think we need to add anything.
All right, let's leave it there. And we're going to start with maybe the least challenging topic and talk about what's your personal inflation rate. I think this is an important topic that doesn't get a lot of attention. We often hear about the headline CPI number, right? And of course, last year was causing a lot of problems for people, hit 9.1%. That was the highest inflation rate in the US since the early 1980s. Good news is today it's much lower, still above, let's say, the average of the last 20 years, but we're down to 3.7% today. So certainly better than where we were a year ago. But how do they calculate that CPI? Well, they assign weights to all these different areas, right? They're looking at housing, by far most important component, 44% of the index. You have food, 14%, transportation, almost 17%, medical care, 8%. And they're trying to make an assumption about how everyone as a whole, the American consumer, spends money. But as we know, everyone's different. And for everyone, this pie chart's going to look very different. And the interesting thing is that it's going to translate into different rates of spending. So what do you think about trying to calculate from a budget standpoint what your personal inflation rate is? And have you seen, in talking with clients, just a huge variability in terms of what that picture actually looks like?
Yeah, I mean, this is such a great topic because almost nobody talks about it. They talk about just inflation as if it's this universal thing, like the price of a candy bar and going to the hospital and college and oil all moved up 8% or up 3%. And as you point out, that's not how it works. And I think a great example of that is coming out of COVID. You saw very high appreciation of assets. Like if you owned stock or you owned real estate, you saw that inflation was wonderful for you. I mean, the value of all these things really rocketed. But at the same time, the cost of things that most of the population does not own stock. Most of the population does not own real estate. And they saw the cost of oil and food rocket. For them, it was devastating, right? They don't have anything on their balance sheet going up, but the cost to drive to work has gone up. The cost to drive the kids to school has gone up. The cost to put food on the table has gone up. So it's experienced very, very differently. Coming out of COVID, we really saw that K-shaped recovery for some people. For people that were asset owners, they saw everything was wonderful. It rocketed. And for those that weren't, the people that need help the most, inflation was really crushing. You also see people report on inflation, however works for them. Like my favorite is Paul Krugman at the New York Times, will report on inflation and say, except for oil or except for food and oil. I mean, like things that are actually very, very critical to the way.
I think he said, except for the last time I saw was except for food, energy, shelter, and maybe another thing as well.
Except for
he said, without those things, inflation is nothing. Has been
totally
nothing.
under
So
control.
What are you complaining about?
Yeah. Unless you're in the 90% of the population that doesn't have a lot of stock in real estate, it's totally fine. So in the aggregate, we need the number in the aggregate without people like Paul Krugman pulling out stuff. But we also experience this very differently. We can even experience differently within the same economic class. Like if you got two households that are the same net worth, the same income, but one's got a bunch of kids going to private schools, and you see private college inflation is ridiculous, right? They're experiencing inflation very differently than someone whose kids are out of school. Or if you've got somebody who's covering a lot of their own healthcare costs, they're not on Medicare yet, they've retired early, that is crushing inflation. And so all of these different components, when you see that headline number, it is important because it does drive a lot of how the markets work and the way the aggregate economy is going. But really, to you, it is not really that indicative of what you're spending and what your life is going to be like.
Right. And so figuring out when you're doing your financial plan and just breaking down, getting your credit card statement, getting your checking account statement, and just breaking this down, you don't have to do it every week, once a year, figuring out where am I spending money. And the advantage of doing that is then you can figure out, well, what can I cut back on? What can I try to reduce? Can I try to reduce my personal inflation rate? And there are certain things that are in your control, certain things that are out of your control. But just figuring out that information alone, I think, would be helpful to a lot of people. And what's interesting today, I think the biggest divide that we have is that housing component, right? You have a whole generation of people. If we look at the baby boomers, they bought homes when prices were much lower. They've refinanced their interest rates or paid off their mortgage rates. So their housing costs, that percentage much lower for them, right, than younger generations. And the interesting thing is, and some people were surprised about this, is you're seeing that generation actually spending more money than any other group at this point. And over the last year, they've actually increased their spending 8%. And I don't know if you've come across this, but it's a very interesting thing, because often we talk about people spending less in their retirement. We're actually seeing them spend more. And one of those things that they're spending money on is playing catch up here. In 2020, people didn't go out to live entertainment, sporting events. Now they're doing that. They're enjoying. I know you're taking advantage of that, going to as many concerts as possible. But is this something you're seeing, this interesting divide where baby boomers are sitting pretty well and they're actually feeling comfortable about spending more?
Yeah, I think you have a confluence of several different things here. Boomers are spending more than anybody else because of the wealth effect. People spend more when they feel wealthy. We know that charitable giving goes up when the stock market goes up. People do go across all generations, spend more on vacations when the stock market and real estate goes up. But who's benefited the most from the boom in home prices? Who's benefited the most from the boom in 401ks and stocks? It's the boomers, right? So they are a very wealthy generation in the sense that they've really benefited from this spike in all these assets. So they have more money than they thought they would have generally. And you've got the revenge spending coming out of COVID, right? Hey, I was locked up for a while. I'm going to make the most of my life now. I've got more money than I thought I was going to have. And I'm going to make the most of my life. And you see that reflected in what I love, which is live entertainment. I love going to live sports. And I love going to concerts, and these things are more packed than ever and have been the big beneficiary of boomer spending.
No question. And we've seen that translate into the continued economic expansion, definitely driving that. We're supposed to get a GDP number. We'll see if it comes out this high, but I think they're talking about 5% for the third quarter. And so the U.S. consumer for now isn't dead just yet. But I want to move on and tackle healthcare here. Unaffordable healthcare, as I'm calling it here. And why am I saying that? Because of this chart right here, which shows you the increase in annual premiums for families going back to 1999. And so if you go back to then, you're looking about 5,000 per year. Today, you're talking about 22,000. And you would expect the premium to go up over time, but you would expect it to go up relatively close to the rate of inflation. Obviously, workers are going to be paid more, materials are going to cost more. But what actually happened over this period of time was just a huge divide where you had a 288% increase in the average family premium versus a 77% increase for CPI. So you're talking about 6.4% per year increase in health insurance premiums, 2.6% per year for CPI. That's just an enormous gap. And who's benefiting from this, Peter? Certainly not the end consumer. If we look at who the largest U.S. health insurer is, United Healthcare, their stock since 2000 over this period of time up over 4,000%. And if I showed you a chart of net income, you would just see huge profits. And that compares to a gain for the S&P 500 of 340%. So healthcare companies like the status quo. Obviously, for the consumer, this is putting additional pressure every single year. So this is a tough one. We don't have to solve the whole thing today. Give me a few things, and then I'll give you mine. What are some solutions in your mind? Just one thing, maybe baby steps. I know there's a temptation for people to say, let's tear the whole thing down and start from scratch. But we know that's never going to happen. That's not realistic. What's one thing, if you had a magic wand, that could at least help prevent this cost from escalating higher and maybe start tracking at least with the rate of inflation, and hopefully do the opposite, which is what technology should be doing, which is actually driving that cost down?
It's interesting. We're picking on United Healthcare, which when I tweeted your chart out, I got so many people commenting on it. So many people worked up about it, and I think rightfully so. I mean, obviously people are frustrated with the cost of healthcare, how difficult it is to access and to navigate. But it's not just that; it's the hospital systems. Everything put together is problematic, and it was interesting. J.P. Morgan, Warren Buffett, or it was Jamie Dimon, Warren Buffett. I can't remember who else. Was it Jeff Bezos or somebody? They all got together and we're going to solve healthcare. And a year later, disbanded, having done literally nothing, right? Because it's too big and complex an issue. But we have basic principles that we know make places better. They make that would make people see people quicker, get better outcome, better healthcare, which access to healthcare, better outcomes, and so on. And we know for that to succeed, you have to have competition and skin in the game. You have to have a combination of real competition and skin in the game. And there's not real competition because you have a very big lack of knowledge on the consumer of where they should go and what it costs to go anywhere, right? So no one goes, I'm going to go, or very few people go, hey, I need to go get this kind of procedure or see this kind of doctor. Let me go look at what it costs to go to this person versus that person, which is what we do with everything else, right? An architect, an engineer, a lawyer, a CPA. We want to know, like, what am I get? What am I going to get? What's it going to cost? How does it compare to other places? That's completely missing in this system. And when that's missing, you lose all the incentives for price containment. Now, you obviously have all these third-party payers that are going to drive a lot of this. And I think whether anyone wants it to be the solution or not, I think what is going to happen in the United States is eventually Medicare is going to come down in the age group that it applies to, and all of the private carriers are going to have to match that. Now, why do I think that? Because every couple of years there's a run at that, and every couple of years it loses, but they only have to win once. And what America has shown is you could have total division on an issue, but the second you give people a benefit, they don't want it touched. So let's get some examples here, because I'm sure people on both sides of the aisle don't agree with that statement. But let's just talk about Social Security. If you surveyed a bunch of conservatives and said, hey, I am going to remove Social Security for everybody under this age, they would probably lose their minds, right? Most Americans would lose their minds over that concept. Because even though it is a benefit, it's a government collecting money from people, theoretically, we're going to get to that later, and then distributing it to other people, it's an element of socialism, right? So we have socialism embedded. We're not pure capitalist, and there's no country that's pure socialist. They're really degrees on a spectrum. It's a socialist program, right? So it's a little bit of socialism. But people don't want it taken away. If you go to a bunch of people that are on Medicare and say, hey, we're getting rid of Medicare, they don't want that taken away. So the second you put the benefit in place, it cannot move. It's going to be there in perpetuity. So even though one group might win stopping Medicare from going to a lower age 20 times in a row, the second they lose once, that battle's over. So that is going to happen someday. It's going to drive prices down. It doesn't solve the skin in the game problem. It doesn't solve the quality of care problem. But that's the destiny, I think, of where this is going. Until we really get a team on this that finds a way to get everybody to have more skin in the game, we're not going to see a solution. I'm very curious your take, because I know you think about this a lot. You tweet about it a lot of graphs on it.
Yeah, and I agree that would be the temptation, right? That's the call. There's two different sides, right? There's one side that says what you're saying. The solution needs to be a one-payer system.
No, wait. I did not say that needs to be the solution. That's definitely not, in my mind.
No,
that's
you're
not
saying
the
though that's likely where it's
that's
headed,
where it's
because
going. Yeah, that's where it's going. That's where it's going, no matter what. Yeah, but I don't think that's the solution.
That takes away the cost from you, and it's transferring it to something else, either through future tax increases, or we're just going to borrow the money to pay for it, or something else.
I don't think it's the solution. I just think politically it's where the United States is going. You'll still have private payers. They're just going to be competing with Medicare in more spaces.
Right. So my argument would be that would only drive up the cost even more. And that part of the reason why costs are so high today is because the government is so already involved in things and they're doing things inefficiently, and there isn't enough competition. So the thing that I would try to do, and I don't know the best way to do this, and I don't know why it hasn't been done already, is allow people to buy insurance across state lines, create a national marketplace, create incentives so that United Healthcare, they might lose some of their profit margins. Well, too bad, but they should have more competition. They should, like that. There should be a lower cost alternative. And then number two, and there's a lot of things you can do, but I think what you said hit the nail on the head. There has to be some skin in the game for the person who's going to the doctor in terms of what are they going to pay. Because if they don't view any cost to that service, then they're going to overuse it, right? It's just natural. Whether they need that test or not, if that test is going to be fully covered, they're not going to care about it. And you say, well, what's the harm in that? Well, there's a lot of harm in that waste, and we're all paying for that. So increasing the transparency, that's a very tough but important thing to do, because people should have some choice in terms of pricing. If you go, I went to the doctor and I got a blood test last year, and they asked, do you want a blood test? I said, sure. Then you get a bill a few months later, and it's hundreds of dollars. They billed the insurance company like $5,000, and that's out of pocket. You pay, and you're like, I didn't know that in advance. First of all, maybe I wouldn't have agreed to that. Maybe I would have shopped around for it. But that's a minor little thing, a simple blood test, and obviously it's costing way more than it should be because there's no shopping around. The insurance company negotiated this big deal, I guess, with this group of doctors or this big healthcare system, and they decided on that. So maybe that's a big ask, but I think you have to put more emphasis on transparency, and you have to give people skin in the game. So that means, I think, what you have to say is, if you're going to subsidize it for people, and that's in large part what the Affordable Care Act did, well, maybe a better way would be using some other income transfer, giving some other welfare type of system, and then letting those people choose the insurance for themselves rather than providing 100% of their insurance. And in that case, then they would have incentive to shop around for the lowest price care. They would have incentive not to overuse it. They would have incentive not to go to the hospital for primary care. And so little things like that, and we can get into drugs, prescription drugs as well, which is another whole mess of things. But we have to start small, Peter. And I don't believe that handing the government more power in this instance, yes, it would be. I agree with you that people would like it, the people that aren't paying for that. But ultimately, it's going to cause the national debt issue that we keep talking about to get worse and worse, because I don't think there's going to be appetite for people to pay more in terms of higher Medicare premiums or any of that, right?
I mean, the best case scenario is you have 5 national competitors that there's so much transparency that they're forced to compete somewhat on price. There's transparency and skin in the game on the part of the consumer. It can be very, very tiny amount. That's not where it's going, I don't think, but that would be the ultimate solution that would balance controlled pricing with quality of care and transparency. I don't think that's where we're going, though.
All right, so we'll leave it there. We'll follow up on this next year. Hopefully, there'll be something that comes out. I haven't heard it being a big election issue so far, but no. I would imagine that it should be. And for employers and employees alike, this is just becoming an increasing cost that we're all going to have to bear unless something is done. And letting the market attack this like it attacks other areas, I think, would be a good thing to start out with. But let's see what happens there. Okay, so healthcare. Now we move to Social Security. Here's the big question. When will Social Security run dry? And Social Security is a big thing for most Americans. A lot of retirees rely on this. The good news is it's adjusted for inflation. So over the last 3 years, we saw in total a 19% increase in terms of the payment. So 66 million Americans are receiving Social Security. Their monthly payments are going up 19% over the last few years. And if we look at who's paying in versus who's taking out, the math here, Peter, as you know, is population is aging, fewer workers are paying in. And what that means is that now that trust fund is going down each and every year, and it's projected to go down to zero by 2033. And if nothing is done before that point, what the solution will have to be is you have to cut payments for beneficiaries, and no one wants to see that. So give me your take in terms of what would be, and we'll try to do the same thing with healthcare, maybe one or two things that we could do. There's a lot of options here on the table in terms of potential fixes to this so that we don't run dry in 10 years.
Well, when Social Security came out, the first month you got Social Security was actually your life expectancy. So when they set it up, the expectation was, okay, when you turn 62, you're supposed to be dead, and that's if you happen to be alive, we're going to pay you Social Security. Well, today that's different. You get it at 67, but your life expectancy's in the 80s. This is a big part of why the system's broken. The other part is the government is paying people out but not collecting money. To your point, that matches it. There are so many solutions here, and I think this is one of those problems that I think it's clear what is going to happen. So forget about what I think. I'm just going to say what I think is going to happen. We're going to borderline on, first of all, no one's going to touch this until it's actually an imminent crisis, because in a democracy, if you've got Republicans and Democrats and somebody touches this issue, the opponent's going to say, oh, they want to cut Social Security, and then 3% less people will vote for them without getting the facts, and then they will lose the re-election. So no one's touching this, right? They have to get to a point where they go, I'm saving Social Security, right? It's going to completely collapse if I don't do something. So that's when it's going to be addressed. So down the road. And the way they're going to address it is several fold. One, they're going to say, look, if you're under 40, you don't get this until you're 74, or you're getting a smaller amount. They're going to change the rules on the younger generations. They're going to do that because the older generations vote. The older generations are the ones that are relying on it and expecting it and going to be the maddest if you change it. And people under 40 don't think they're getting it anyway. So or it's so far in the future, well, this is something 27 years ago. Was I even going to get it? Who cares? They're not going to do it. So I think that that's one thing that's going to happen. Second, I think they're going to say, look, if you make more than this amount of money a year, we're taxing the living daylights out of your Social Security benefit. So it's great. You're making $500,000 a year in retirement. We're not going to be giving you your full Social Security benefit. We're going to cut that. That's a very, very tiny sliver of the population. Very easy to do that to them and not have a consequence. And then second, you can see them applying the payroll tax to a bigger, or I guess third, to a higher group of people. So there are solutions here, and there are political solutions. I'm not saying they're great, but these are the things that are actually going to happen and how it's almost certainly going to unfold over time.
Right. And that probably is the most likely outcome. But what I didn't hear you mention is cutting spending from somewhere else.
Not. They're not going to do that. This would obviously be, they're not going to do that. I mean, that's not in the Republicans and Democrats. They argue about what they're going to overspend on. But whether we've had Biden or Trump, or it just doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. In all these instances, we see them overspend. They just overspend on different things. That's the only difference.
Right. So I think some combination, right, and it's impossible, of these things has to happen, right? And the easiest one, most palatable for most people, would be obviously tax wealthier people more, right? There's just few of them that'll get passed, or saying that there's no limit on what you're taxed at. So right now it's just your first 160,000. I'm sure everyone will be happy with that going up to 10 million, 20 million, 100 million, a billion, right? That billionaires, people are making $1 billion a year, these hedge fund managers, no one's going to care if they're taxed extra, right?
Yeah.
That's the easy thing. Of course, we know that's not enough, right, to close this gap. It's just one path to it. What I want to talk about, though, Peter, is the longer term here. Like, how do we get away from this crazy system of you don't have an account that's actually yours? So I'm okay with doing any combination of those things so that we ensure that Social Security remains. We know how it's important. For lower income people, it's over 80% of what they rely on in retirement. That's enormous, right? We don't want to take that away. They've been paying in. They should expect to get it. But what I would say is there has to be some transition. What private employers have done is change to defined benefit to defined contribution, right? Why isn't the government thinking at all about that? If you look at the return that you're getting from paying into Social Security, or that we're going to get, I'm going to expect to get, it's extremely low. It's nowhere near what the stock market would give you over a long period of time. And there's no guarantee that it's going to be there. You can't leave it to your heirs. You don't have any choice in terms of where you can invest it. We can debate all that, but why not divert a small percentage and start with younger workers today and start putting it in an actual account? So we're not talking about the same thing 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. Is that wishful thinking? Is that a crazy concept to have an actual account that you own? If we like this system, and we could debate whether it's necessary or not, but people seem to like it. And if we don't force people, I guess, to save for retirement, the problem is they might not save it. And then you're going to have to provide for them at that point anyway. So we kind of agreed that we should be doing this, but why not have it similar to the 401k system where you actually own that account?
I think that some countries do this, as you know, and I don't see us going there and if they do it, they're going to have to really limit what people can do. They're going to have to limit like what they can invest in. And then you're going to have a whole bunch of debate about that. Because what's going to happen? How would you propose we give everybody an account and one person puts it all in Dogecoin and Dogecoin goes to zero? What are we going to do with that person? Are we going to say when you're 70, if you don't have any money, we're going to have you live in the street? I know there's some people that would say yes to that, but that's not what we're going to do, right?
Right.
I think most people would say no. We want to live in a country where no one lives in the street. That's the idea.
So throw that out the window. They can only invest in a stable treasury, fund. Then do you think that's possible?
I love the idea, because then people have ownership in it. They see it, and it really moves it out of this theoretical government thing where they take money in and put money out. Instead, it's like people's money in accounts. I would love to see a privatized system where you just let private enterprises, and you have rules, just like we have with 401k. And the rules are the fees can't be over this amount, and you can't do commissions, and you have to invest in these kinds of things. And then the consumer can choose which of those programs that they want to go into. I like something like that where people are contributing to their own account. I don't see it happening, but that would be a wonderful outcome. I think they're going to keep the game the same, and they're going to just change the rules a little bit.
We'll wait till the very end. So 2032 at midnight at the end of that year,
they'll pass a law saving the program.
Right. And what we haven't talked about, Peter, is, and I guess we're talking about it running out of money, but they could just simply borrow more money at that point, right? And not do any of these things.
Unfortunately,
that is another possibility that we haven't talked about, and that might be the ultimate possibility. Who knows what that other problems that will cause, but that would probably be the most popular, because then nobody has to give up anything. All right, so we gave the options there, and everyone can look at this. Any congressmen and senators that are watching this, these are your options. You could wait 10 years, or you could do something about it now. They're obviously going to wait because they want to get reelected. So let's talk about education now, Peter. We did healthcare, we did Social Security, we got education here. You tweeted out this tweet, and we've talked about this before, but 4 things that should be taught in high school. And talk me through this tweet and how important this would be, just this basic understanding of these concepts for everybody in high school.
Yeah, and I speak at a lot of high schools, and most high schools don't have a class that covers this. There are some, and I applaud them, that have a personal finance course. It's usually 1 half hour, in one semester, and it's usually an elective, but at least there are a few that have it. But it seems really silly to me that we don't teach the very, very basics, because you can be the best in any profession. If you don't understand the very basics, you can put your whole household at risk. And number 1 on this list is credit card debt. We all know about compounding. If you put $1,000 in the market and you're in 10%, your money will double in 7 years. It's pretty powerful. Well, reverse compounding works the same way. If you borrow $1,000 at 20% or whatever the crazy rate is today, higher than that, I know, maybe 28%. Well, that can really get away from you. That keeps piling up, and that $1,000 in just a couple of years is $2,000. So really understanding how a credit card works, how interest is calculated, why you should never, ever carry a balance going forward. And there are a lot of reasons to teach that basic. Creating a budget, very simple. Like, what goes out has to be less than what comes in. This is something that pretty sophisticated people don't really follow, and it starts to create problems. And of course, learning about the power of saving early. I mean, if you teach some people in high school, hey, how the biggest asset an investor can have is not expertise, it's not low fees, it's not low taxes, it's time. If you take a 25 or 30-year-old, I mean, your money is going to double. If you get the average stock market return, your money is going to double every 7 years. Well, that's a hell of a big difference than if you start when you're 50 versus when you start when you're 30. And of course, understanding how loans work. Not all loans are the same. I see a lot of young people get the lowest mortgage they can, not realizing it's going to go variable and what risk that poses to them. These are very basic things. And look, the list could be a lot longer, but this is the list that gets people into trouble. And if they can just get these basics down, they can really get on a good path really, really early with the savings and not find themselves blowing things up along the way. You have anything to add to this list, Charlie?
No, I think this is great. Number 4 is huge, and we've talked about the education loan, and for the time to have that conversation has to be before the fact, not after the fact. Yeah. And yes, the loans are too high, and it's causing problems for a lot of people. But if you learn in high school, and this goes along with the other factors as well, okay, this is what this career path might earn. This is what this degree is going to cost me. This is the math of what I'm going to be paying in the student loan. It's not very complex. It's a few inputs, and you can make a better decision. Arm these students with that information. They're going to make better choices if they have that information. And the credit card thing just can't be overstated. Once again, here, Peter, we have credit card rates hitting another record high, 21%. So if you have a balance on your credit card, that's compounding, like you said, in the wrong direction. All right, so let's end here. Signal or noise is going to be the toughest signal or noise yet. We're going to talk about war. Obviously, war is front and center today. The big fear is another World War III. There's multiple conflicts going on. We had, of course, tragic events. October 7th, 1,400 innocent Israelis killed. It's their version of 9/11 times 10. That would be the equivalent of 50,000 Americans dying in a single day, which we just can't process that. And that, of course, creates a lot of fear. There's obviously now retaliation going on. There's escalation potential. Iran might be getting into it. The U.S. involvement might be getting into it. Then we still have Russia and Ukraine as well on top of it, plus Taiwan and China. Peter, what is an investor supposed to do with all of this? There's always a threat of war, but it seems like the threat is elevated today, let's say, versus any time in the last 10, 20 years. It seems that way. Am I wrong? And how should an investor process this?
So I'm not going to suddenly turn into a geopolitical, this is not my job, a genius. I love when everyone commentates on every little thing. But what I do want to address is when does it matter to markets? I mean, it's so tough to talk about because you just watch the enormous suffering that is happening right now. And I think that, you just wish you could wave your hand and get, people to reach a long-term peaceful conclusion here, which I think is going to happen someday. And I remember several presidents talking about this, that they really had a high degree of confidence it would happen. And the only question was how much suffering was going to have to continue to happen before we reached a peaceful conclusion. But when you look at it from the question you posed, which is, well, what should an investor look at? To really just pull back, you have to just say, okay, from an investor standpoint, is this going to change the future expected earnings of the marketplace, of the markets, of the stocks, right? And so you're taking a very different look than a politician or a humanitarian, right? You're basically asking yourself, should I panic? Should I go to cash? What should I do about this? So let's take an example. You referenced 9/11. So let's use 9/11 as an example. 9/11, the stock market went down a ton, 40%. And it was so swift, the market was closed, right? They wouldn't even let the market be open for a while.
That's right.
And it should have been that way. And the reason is that happened on American soil in New York City in a financial center, right? And so, and everyone knew it was going to escalate immediately, right? And so you basically had to look at that and say, And there was a lot of expectation there would be follow-on attacks, right? That didn't materialize, but there was a lot of expectation there would be. Well, that affected the consumer. People cocooned. They stayed home. For real, vacation, people spent less on vacations. They spent less on going out. They didn't go to the movies. They didn't go to, I mean, everything really slowed down. So you can look at that situation and say, okay, that's impacting future earnings. If we look at what we're dealing with today, as it stands today, right, before we get to Elon Musk's World War III comment or Jamie Dimon's potential World War III comment, as it stands today, it's no impact, right? Because it's tragic. Everyone has an opinion, right, on this. It's horrific, what's happened. But when we look at, is it impacting your day to day? Are you not going to go on vacation? You might not go to vacation in the Middle East, right? But you're still going on vacation. You're still going to McDonald's. You're still going to Disney World. Nothing's changed, which is why we don't see the market overreacting. Now, of course, if it expands, completely different story. And I think the expansion is, and I think there's just enough public knowledge about this, is the expansion is if you bring Iran into it, and then you have the US into it, then Russia might just get into it. And then you don't know, will China take advantage of that? We do know that when we got preoccupied with Ukraine, we know that China went closer to Taiwan's airspace and apparently breached it several times for the first time ever, right? So as we're preoccupied with other things, would be the time for those things to happen. Now, the market looks at it as all of this horrific stuff as an extremely improbable series of events. Otherwise, the market would be pricing it in. The market would be saying, look, I think this is probably going to happen, and therefore I'm getting my money the hell out of the market. The market would be like what we saw with 9/11. It would be down 44, 45%. We don't see that because the marketplace looks at this and believes what most of the strategists that we all hear from when we're on these calls are saying, which is, look, sure, Iran would love to take advantage of this, China would love to take advantage of this, and Russia would like to take advantage of this, but probably they won't because there is a very significant mismatch in military force between the United States and the counterparties, right? If that mismatch did not exist, they probably would take advantage of it. Because the mismatch exists, they probably know what the ultimate outcome of that horrific war would be, and it probably won't happen. That doesn't mean it's right. I'm not an expert on this. I'm just saying what we hear for strategists.
Mutually assured destruction.
Yeah, and right? how the market and this is why the marketplace isn't the stock market and so on around the world is not having a reaction to this, right?
So you're not right. You're not saying clearly. You're not saying if this escalates to the point, God forbid, of a World War III, clearly that would have an impact on the markets.
Yeah, and there's a lot of stuff between here and World War III. If you just get even a skirmish with Iran that starts to create oil supply issues, you've got this problem now. Russia and Ukraine. You add Iran. You go to $110 oil. You're going to have a recession. It's a lot of people think, well, I mean, people drive less. That's not, it's not just that. Everything is about oil. I mean, when you get your Amazon package delivered, when you buy a cheeseburger at McDonald's, well, guess what? That got moved on a truck that used oil. So that would be the intermediary thing that could happen. That really does cause a lot of negative consequences.
I guess the ultimate question for an investor, assuming you have that longer time frame, is there going to be a long-term impairment to earnings? For sure, you could see some weakness in the short term if people start to change their behavior. They're not doing it just yet, as you said. But if there was something that would lead to that change in behavior, or let's say we had to borrow, and we're already borrowing a lot, but we had to borrow trillions more to fund this, and that led to a spike in inflation again, right? Clearly, those things would cause problems and potential impairments in the short run, but it's hard to predict how 20 years from now that would still be going on, and hopefully it wouldn't be. And this chart, no one should rely on something like this when you look into previous wars that the U.S. has been involved in. It's not to say that it would play out the same fashion, but oftentimes the market is, and it's kind of amazing that this could still go on, but the market is still positive in most cases. If we look back in the Gulf War, Vietnam War, Korean War, and so on, the average of all wars, you still have a positive return. And part of that reason, and that's not to say there wasn't short-term declines within that period of time. That's to say by the end of it, the market, of course, was looking ahead to a better future. So I think during World War II is probably a good example. I believe the market bottomed then in around 1942, and it was after the U.S. won a major battle in the Pacific. The market's starting to look ahead to the U.S. winning this outcome and things being better, and that's hard for people to process because you're still in the midst of all of this bad news happening. But again, it does come back to, at the end of the day, is the U.S. economy growing? Are corporations profitable? Are they more profitable 20 years from now than they are today? And we often talk about this, but this is an important time to think about this. You have to be a long-term optimist. If you think that there's going to be a war that's going to drag on for 20 years and all the major powers are going to be involved in that, that's going to be an impossible situation for investors. But assuming that doesn't happen, we'll likely get through whatever happens next, and hopefully peace obviously prevails. That would be the best outcome for everyone.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's it's so tough to even talk about with all the suffering that began on October 7th and continues. And I just, but the reality is you have to assume there will eventually be peace. And it's an easy assumption over the long run because there is no incentive for World War III, right? There are a lot of short-term incentives for a lot of different things to happen, depending on your, all sorts of different views. But there is no incentive for Iran or Russia or China or the United States to really have a world war. There's a positive consequences in the short run for some to try certain things, but there's an enormous amount of negative consequences for everybody if it goes on. So I think the good thing about being an optimist is it couples with realism, right? It couples with realism, not just when it comes to war, but just when it comes to the marketplace in general. You're being an optimist if you think that the economy will grow over 10 years from now, that technology will continue, that people around the globe will emerge from poverty as we expect over 1 billion people to do in the next 10 years. Yeah, that's optimistic, but it's also realistic. It's the most likely outcome. And you have to stay focused on that as a long-term investor. And it also makes it a little easier to be a human being if you can think that way as well.
Absolutely. All right, we'll leave it right there, Peter. I think we covered enough serious topics for today. I don't think there's anything else that we could cover that would be more difficult than what we already accomplished. So hopefully this was helpful. Thanks everyone for joining us today. We'll see you next time on Signal or Noise.